Welcome to the Wisdom of Jacob's Ladder. I'm your host, Jacob Cooper, best-selling author of Life After Breath and the Wisdom of Jacob's Ladder. Today, I have a wonderful guest coming your way, Pastor John Burke, who's a New York Times best-selling author of Imagine Heaven and the recent release, Imagine the God of Heaven, which has just come out in November. John Burke is a wonderful researcher of near-death experiences with over 3 decades of experience. He's also a pastor of a church as well too. So he merges near-death experience research as well as within, biblical scripture and within the work that he does. So we have a fascinating guest who's a very fitting guest to be here on the Wisdom of Jacob's Ladder. For those of you new to my channel, we love having you here to be a part of our community. Please make sure to stay in touch and be a part of this community by considering to hit that subscription button and as well as liking and sharing our videos so the world is able to hear this wonderful interview with John Burke, and you don't want to miss it. Without further ado, we welcome John Burke onto the Wisdom of Jacob's Ladder. John Burke, it's a big honor to have you here on the Wisdom of Jacob's Ladder. Thank you for coming here.
Oh, thanks for inviting me, Jacob. It's a pleasure.
John, I am in deep admiration of your work. It certainly reaches the masses, and with near-death experiences, it's so significant to be able to reach so many people, because people really need to hear that this stuff is real and true. And from a near-death experiencer myself, I really have to applaud your work. But I was reading through your books, and I saw that your journey was, I would say, a little bit unconventional, and maybe you could fill me in for this, because it seemed to come from a left brain analytical standpoint. And then 30 years ago, or something like that, I think grief brought you to this journey where it was, I think your father was about to cross over, then you started to read, just happened to come across you. So tell us a little bit about, your work and how it kind of began. Was it this moment that it began, or tell us like the pre-John Burke and where John Burke is today, because it's quite a transformation over the decades that you've had.
Yeah, without a doubt. And there's sometimes I feel like I have my own out-of-body experience, kind of going, how did I get here? And how, what am I doing?
Right.
Because I've always been very analytical. I was an engineer. I worked as an engineer, and so very skeptical. I was an agnostic too, and just kind of like, I don't know about all this stuff because there's no proof, there's no evidence. And I was very curious. I wasn't super closed. I was just like, well, I keep asking questions and nobody can answer any of my questions. So there must not be anything to it. My dad was dying of cancer. And someone gave him the very first research on near-death experiences, Moody's book. And I saw it on his bedside table, and I picked it up and I just like, what's this? And start reading it. I couldn't put it down. And I read it in one night. And I said, oh my gosh, like, could this actually be some kind of medical scientific evidence that there really is an afterlife and there really is a God, and like this stuff may be real? And so it opened me up, and that really began my journey of seeking. And after that, a while after that, I came to faith. And at the same time, I was working as an engineer out in Santa Barbara, California, and I didn't know it. I didn't know it back then, but that was kind of a wellspring of where near-death research was starting. And so I kept running into stories, and I started collecting them. I just had this insatiable curiosity to understand, what are these and what do they mean? And, just always asking questions. So yes, over the last, it's probably been over 35 years, and I've studied well over 1,000 near-death experiences and interviewed many. And it wasn't until 2015 that I wrote Imagine Heaven. And during the same time, I also ended up transitioning careers from being an engineer to going into ministry, trying really because out of a desire to help people see what I had seen and the things, the evidence that I was seeing that to me was just so compelling and such good news for everybody. And you know, I was frustrated with experiences in churches in my past where I had asked questions as a skeptic, and you know, nobody knew how to address it. And so actually 25 years ago, we started a church here in Austin for skeptics. Our motto is "Come as you are, no perfect people allowed, and doubters are welcome." And so that's, yeah. And so incorporating, you know, a lot of that together to create a space where people can ask questions, doubt, you know, struggle, but also find that, man, there are a lot of great reasons to believe. And I think as you talk about it, and it applies to our everyday life, it's not just some, you know, pie in the sky, you know, after you die.
It's a nice rhyme.
Not intended to be.
You're a lyrical genius, but I guess you're a 2-time best-selling author, so that makes sense. Yeah. But John, it's interesting because I find a lot of people, I guess you call it the spiritual field, who are able to intentionally or unintentionally use their background in what they do. And so, for instance, you had this engineering background, and now you're understanding the ultimate engineer and architect behind it all. And so it's interesting, the symmetry, quite different orientation, but just how that is just heightened in the work that you do.
No, I agree with you. I look back, and especially, you know, I'm a grandfather now, and you know,
could have fooled me.
I look back and I'm like, I look at the weird twists and turns of my life and what I'm doing now, and I realize, wow, God, you, like all those question marks I had, like, why did I go down that path, and why this, and why that, and yet how they all have come together and intersected. And it, yeah. So I am different approaching this. What a lot of near-death experiencers tell me is kind of like, thank you for being the other side that doubts and is so analytical and just pushes this away, but actually to bring some credibility. And you know, and I think I am able to uniquely, I have not had a near-death experience. I don't have lots of mystical spiritual experiences, but to me, the evidence I saw in studying all these, the overlap, and you know, what I'm also interested in that I write about is just the overlap of what the scriptures say as well, and how it all fits together, and just incredible to me. And so, yeah, so I get passionate about it because it really helped me, you know, in my own life.
Oh, absolutely. And you raise a great point that, you know, and I've been doing seminars throughout the years, you know, after almost everyone in my seminar would say, wow, that was great, but I didn't have what you had, so how could I understand it? And so from your life trajectories, it seems like you don't have to necessarily have a near-death experience to understand this stuff. It seems like you just have to ask questions, be open. There's tons of academic and medical journals out there that really prove so much evidential information and data about that this is real.
Oh yeah, and you know, kind of in both Imagine Heaven, which is my first book, and then Imagine the God of Heaven, which just came out. And kind of my chapter 2 is establishing for the skeptics, right. And so in the first book, in Imagine Heaven, I trace through the same time I was going through this analytical journey. There were a group of medical doctors who, a lot of them are my friends today, who were becoming convinced that consciousness survives death because of the research that they were doing that was coming out. And they started, most of them, you know, heard Moody's stuff, skeptical about it, and then started actually asking patients themselves. And then in Imagine the God of Heaven, this new book, I'm going after all the alternative theories. You know, there are like 30 alternative theories to kind of explain away near-death experience as something other than an actual real experience of a life to come. Wow. And you know, a life beyond the veil. And so I go through 10 points of evidence that convince me that I believe that any alternative theory needs to take into account, or it's not really an alternative theory. It's really just throwing spaghetti at the wall, trying to wipe it away.
Right. It seems more of a dichotomy of skepticism versus cynicism, where you already have your mind made up and you're just going to, if you cross your eyes, you probably could. Like everything is like, no, no, no. And they're just not open to this stuff.
Yeah. Like, Dr. Michael Shermer is a, well-known skeptic, and he's taken this on, and he's kind of thrown out two things that I've heard him say. One, at first it was like, well, this is just, there are a lot of chemicals flooding your brain as you're going to die. And this is just kind of the brain's way of making the passing into nothingness easier. And then I think he started to realize, wait, that doesn't deal with evidence like veridical perception. So, one of the main things that got my attention as a skeptical engineer was that when people die, many times, they leave their body. As they say they still have a body, spiritual body, and not with 5 senses, but more like 50 senses and blended senses. And it's like life on steroids all of a sudden. And, but they are usually up above many times the resuscitation and what's happening in the room. And when they're resuscitated, they can describe things that were happening that they should not have been able to see because they had, for instance, no heartbeat, no brain waves. So if we're just our brain waves, then how was that working? It doesn't explain that. And there've been studies done, like Dr. Janice Holden did a study of 93 patients who had near-death experiences. Each one may have made, 5 observations, 10 observations that could be checked out. And she found that of all their observations, 92% of them were completely accurate. That's incredible. 6% were mostly accurate, maybe some discrepancies. 2% were wrong. And it turned out that was one patient, that was just probably, making it up. So, that's incredible. And the idea that it's just chemicals flooding the brain doesn't take that into account. It also doesn't take into account the fact that people blind from birth, when they have a near-death experience, suddenly can see. They have this mind sight, this ability to perceive visually, and they experience all the same elements of a near-death experience that sighted people do.
It's just fascinating. And there's no way to explain this, because I've heard you in interviews discussing that in our realm, even, the light that we see is based off of the sun's lights, right? The amount of varieties of rays or whatever that the sun has, that's what we know. And then when you go onto the other side, there's a whole other light that occurs that's beyond this reality, and people have that. And so it's just like things you just can't explain, where the visually impaired can't. I never saw anything, but they know where light comes from, not only what it looks like, but also people who can't hear, they could describe sounds. So it's just fascinating that we are more than our physical senses, and it's evidential when people have these, experiences.
Well, yeah. So to me, it's just fascinating because, like, consistently people describe the light of heaven as palpable. That's a word I've heard many times. Like, not light like our light, but light that is also love and life commingled, and it's coming out of everything. So this one guy who was blind, 8 years old when he died, he told me, it was the light as I'm walking up this field, going up a hill toward this beautiful wall of a city or something, he said. And he's seeing palm trees and flowers and these tall grasses, but light is coming out of everything. And light and love is coming out of everything. And then he gets up to the wall, and it's like this light is coming out of what looked like these almost like gemstones. And he said it was like I was mesmerized by it, and I wanted to touch it, but I was a little worried about touching it because it was like so powerful,
so potent, yeah,
coming out. And that's not just Brad, but Vicky, another, blind person, Debbie, another blind person I have in the new book. They're saying the same things. Now, to me, the correlation that's fascinating is that a Jewish prophet writing in 780 BCE, okay, Isaiah, writes in Isaiah chapter 60 that in heaven there is no sun or moon because the light of God is its light. And then in Revelation 21 in the New Testament, John, who says he was taken up into heaven and had an experience of heaven, says the same thing, that the glory of God is its light and the nations will walk in that light. And that's exactly what blind people say. Now, a blind person, though, because when they're resuscitated, they're still blind. And so where would they have ever heard that light comes out of everything? Right? I mean, they didn't know the Bible, and most Christians who read the Bible don't even realize that.
For someone to know something, there has to be a point of origin of it. There, so for them to describe this, it has to be based off of something they experienced. Certainly wasn't within this life that they had or that they know. So it has to come from somewhere.
They would never have heard that. Yeah. And so all these alternative theories, they don't take those things into account. They don't take into account people who, when they die, then meet people on the other side that they didn't know previously.
Yeah.
Like kids that I write about who have a near-death experience and on the other side meet a sibling and then come back and, they're talking about their sister that they met on the other side, but they don't have a sister. And their mom and dad are like, what do you mean your sister? You don't have a sister. No, I met her. And, here, and then the aha is like, oh my gosh, we had a miscarriage.
It's fascinating. It really is.
And that's not just a one-off.
Right.
Yeah.
And it's interesting. I mean, I love the work that you do because you're able to interview people from all different types of cultures and backgrounds, and you're able to find a similar parallels where no matter what your life experience is, young or old, middle-aged, whatever, there's commonalities that just defy any form of logic that unites us all.
Yeah.
It's just amazing.
Yeah. And in the new book, Imagine the God of Heaven, it's really incredible because I bring you into 70 people's stories from every continent on earth. And they are meeting the same God consistently. This God of light, but they describe God as, again, like a light that's brighter than the sun, but 1,000 times brighter, but not hard to look at, mesmerizing, beautiful. And at the same time, a love that comes from this God of light that our word love just doesn't do justice to. And not an impersonal force, but a very personal being. And in fact, a fun person to be with, an enjoyable person to be with. And, probably a lot of the different aspects of near-death experiences and stuff. But to me, again, that's another thing that's evidential. Why would 48% of near-death experiencers all around the globe encounter this same God of light and love, and they know this is God, and many times in His presence, they have a life review, which you're probably familiar with, and He lets them know, hey, you still have a purpose on earth, and sometimes He gives them a choice whether to come back or not. Or to cross over into, I guess, what's crossing to eternity. But sometimes He says, no, you still have work to do, and sends them back.
Yeah, it's like one of two ways. I mean, obviously you don't stay there. Otherwise it wouldn't be a near-death experience. It would be a death experience. You wouldn't be telling your story. So this may be a minute question, but I've noticed both of your book titles have the same, word at the front, imagine. It has to do with heaven or God. And wondering because so many people seem to regurgitate God, like God that was taught to them, and that's how they see it. Versus imagination, you think of the creative source, you think of this file of creative energy, and that's, at least when I had my NGE, that's what I experienced, this
Mm.
infinite creative source. But I'm wondering for yourself, was there any type of, because that's a specific word to use, was there an intention behind that word within your books that
Yeah.
is based on your philosophy and your findings of your research?
Yeah, that's actually a very important word to me. I had to fight for it for the second book.
All right, right.
Um, uh, it's important in this way. Well, first of all, um, you know, I'm writing a lot to, to skeptics, to anybody really, because when I write, I hope that skeptics like I was will see not only the evidence, but the power of the stories of what people say and the correlation. And the correlation, I'm also trying to show Christians, especially as I'm a Christian pastor, that this correlates with what God's been revealing through the Bible all along. And so I'm trying to show that as well. And one of the things that I think the Bible actually tells us to set our minds on things above, not just on things of the earth, which means you've got to use your imagination. And God gave us our imaginations. Our imagination doesn't mean everything we imagine is imaginary. If I imagine being with the woman I love who lives, let's say, in another city, that's drawing my heart to her. It doesn't mean she's imaginary, but I can't see her. I can't be with her for a time. And so our imaginations are powerful. If you think about it, we don't create anything without imagining it first. So before anything comes physically into being, it first comes to being in our imaginations. Well, that's a
right.
gift from God.
Yeah.
And yet I find so many people have a horrible imagination of what the life to come is.
What do you think that is?
I was just talking to a guy. I told you I was just kind of counseling someone who's a twin who lost his brother, and was really grieving. And he was just saying, he was saying he was frustrated with the churches around him where he lives in the area because they won't talk about what's to come. They don't talk about it. And he was asking me, why that is. And I said the same thing. I said, well, I think because we don't take the time to use and engage our imaginations about what's to come. I mean, God put a lot of it in the scriptures. And I mean, that's what I'm trying to show, the amazing correlations. And they're there, but you kind of have to tease them out as well. Like for instance, I don't know if you experience this, but near-death experiencers often talk about the colors of heaven or the colors of life to come. Like they far exceed the color spectrum of the light of the sun. So our colors are a breakdown of the spectrum of the light of the sun. But if the light of heaven is the glory of God, the light of God, surely that's going to exceed our narrow width of colors. We already know there are, ultraviolets and infrareds and all kinds of spectrum of colors we don't even see. And so, that makes total sense. And yet the Bible alludes to that. People on the other side, like this one Hindu man who grew up in India, a manufacturing engineer. His name is Santosh. I write about him in Imagine the God of Heaven. And he's there in heaven with this God of light. And he's looking out over this holy city. He describes the same city that John describes in Revelation 21, which is amazing because he grew up Hindu.
Right. His background, there's no information, in his religion, yeah.
Yeah. And yet, he said, my eyesight was telescopic. So I could see, it seemed like thousands of miles. And he describes this city that's thousands of miles and a square and 12 gates and all this stuff. But that telescopic vision It's also in scripture. So in Revelation 21, when John says he was taken up into heaven, he said, and I was taken in the spirit to a very high mountain. And he's looking down on the same city of God that Santosh and others I write about are describing. But he says that he reads the names that are on the foundation stones and over the gate. How does he read from a very high mountain?
Right. It defies any form of our logic here. Yeah.
But again, he's pointing out just what Paul also said, that our new bodies have new powers. I actually think that the Apostle Paul, who, he wrote a lot of the New Testament, I think he had a near-death experience.
I've heard that before. Yeah.
I'm not sure of this, but,
right.
It says in Acts chapter 14 that Paul was traveling throughout kind of what's now Greece, Turkey area. And in Lystra, a mob turns on him and stones him to death. And they drag him out of the city and leave him there for dead. Now, they knew how to kill people with stones back then. It was a common way. They usually probably didn't miss. And yet it says Paul then revived, gets up, and goes back into the city.
Wow.
And then Paul says in 2 Corinthians 12, he says 14 years ago, he's talking about himself, 14 years ago, whether in my body or out of my body, I don't know, only God knows. Why would he say that? Well, because we still have a spiritual body, right? And then he says, I was taken up into heaven, into the third heaven, and there I saw and heard things inexpressible. And then he said, some things that people are not allowed to tell, which is fascinating because many of you guys say the same thing, that, like, for instance, in God's presence, every question I had was answered as fast as I could, fast as I could ask it in my mind. And they said, now don't ask me to give you the answer now, because I knew I understood it all there, but I wasn't allowed to bring it back. Well, that's exactly what Paul said. Now, Paul also talks in 1 Corinthians 15 about this spiritual body, that our bodies are buried in natural body, but they're raised a spiritual body. They're buried in weakness, but they're raised in the word is dunamos, means power. And so, all these things that near-death experiencers are talking about, I think they're right there. They're right there all along. But I don't think a lot of Christians and pastors have necessarily taken the time to explore and search. And I think that is a gift God gave me, is to be able to, like, hold things in tension that I don't understand. I think engineering kind of taught me that. It does. I can't tell you how many all-nighters I'm pulling in thermodynamics going, I don't understand this at all, and you just kind of stare at the page until all of a sudden it's like something clicks. It's like, oh, I get it. And so in the same way, I think that's been a problem. But I'll tell you one thing that's been encouraging is that a lot of pastors and Christians have read Imagine Heaven now and have seen how it comes together, how it fits together. And it's really starting to open people up in the churches. So I'm encouraged by that.
Yeah, no, you do a lot of daring work that I applaud. Many people who study near-death experiences will just stay in that lane, just the near-death experience lane, and they'll shy away from religions, experiencers as well too. And I think your work is beautiful because you're a bridge between, this research of NDEs and the correlationship of it of the Bible. It's almost like, the OG of NDEs, Raymond Moody, he would study philosophy and merge that with NDEs and how they weren't separate, how it was all intertwined and interconnected. And so it's my hope, because I certainly believe near-death experiencers and near-death experiences could teach us a lot. And sometimes there's, pitfalls of, different types of belief systems, and finding ways to evolve those belief systems, I think, could lead to different outcomes and hopefully a more unified, interconnected world where it's less of ownership of God, but more of seeing it in everyone and everything.
Well, and that's one of the things I'm trying to show in Imagine the God of Heaven, is that, we all put God in a box. And we have to. We're finite. We live constrained with 3 dimensions of space and 1 dimension of time, and God doesn't. And so if we fail to recognize the mysteries of God that we can't fully, just hold in our box, then we're seeking the wrong God, because God is not finite and not bound by that. And so I'm trying to help people expand their box, that God is more beautiful and glorious, powerful, sovereign and control, immanent, transcendent, all those big, words, like Susan, this one indie ear who, when she was 12, she was talking about being there in Jesus' presence in heaven. But then he said to her, and she said it was like being with like this loving big brother, or like the best dad you can ever imagine, just so comfortable and so, at ease. And then he said to her, I'm much more than you see. And then she gets an experience of the vastness of God. I talk about a Jewish woman who had almost the same exact experience. Interestingly, they're both nurses today, but almost the same exact experience. But Susan said to me, all those big words about God, they mean something, but what they mean, and that's what I'm trying to show through the eyes of near-death experiencers, because what they mean helps us trust more. It comes back to how we actually live our lives today. And if you realize that God, who created each one of us, is with us, he is the life force that keeps us all going. And he's there with us, just waiting for us to turn to him. I mean, Paul even said that. He said, in him we live and move and have our very being. And so he's waiting for us to turn to him to lead us and to guide us. And I think that's just such important information for every person to know, because there's such hope there. And that he's also, even though none of us are perfect and we all fall short, that he's a God of forgiveness. He's a God of grace and mercy. And the best way to think is, well, and I try to point that out, like all of our relationships, I think, are just metaphors. The love you have if you have a child, I mean, how do you overdo that? How do you outdo that, right? But maybe the love you felt from a parent or a grandparent, or the love you have, even a romantic love for a spouse or lover. None of those hold a candle to what near-death experiencers consistently say it's like in the presence of the relationship that you've always wanted and never realized. That God is the relationship I've always wanted. And that's why I subtitled Imagine the God of Heaven, Near-Death Experiences, God's Revelation, and the Love You've Always Wanted. Because all our relationships are just a microcosm, just a metaphor of the relationship that God created us to have with him. Now, here's the interesting thing is I know many times people hear that and they're like, well, but I don't want to just be in love with God. Like, I love people. Well, no, all our relationships go deeper in his love. We actually have a problem. I don't know if you've noticed this. I've been a pastor for 25 years and man, many times it's the people we live with that it's the hardest to love. And so we struggle with this, but that's because without depending on the source of love, we run out. And then we get pitted against each other so easily. And yet the Lord is the one who does the opposite. He brings us together. It was Jesus' last prayer, is not on earth, that they may be one, Father, just as you are in me and I am in you. May they be in us. So there's this unity that God created us for. So yeah, in heaven, in his presence. And of course, this is what the great reunion is all about. Near-death experiencers talk about, they often have this welcoming committee of deceased relatives or friends who come to greet them. And it's this joyous reunion. But it's not like we're different people. We're still ourselves. We still have our memories, like hugs, real hugs, kisses are real kisses, but they say, but they go so much deeper. And, the communication, man, I mean, communication's a problem here, right?
Sure.
But just imagine when what we're trying to communicate to one another is complete understanding the thoughts, the heart, the intent, all the things that got that person there, and the feelings of it, and you understand it perfectly.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, when I had my near-death experience, I was able to really have a knowing of people past the surface level of what I knew. And when you go to the other side, you're able to really understand people beyond what they present or their personality. You're able to go to the core of why they are the way that they are. And there's a transparency of the soul where you get it, you understand it. So I love every word that you're saying. And my question for you is, why do you feel people have near-death experiences like myself? Is there a particular, do you feel reason? Like, what do you feel God is trying to tell us? And right now, obviously, it's getting a lot more traction. But as you said before, they've been around for thousands of years. This is nothing new. But there seems like a lot going on, and near-death experiences are playing a big role right now on the map and scope of spiritual transformation these days.
Well, I'll try not to give you my super long answer, but I think they are a gift from God for our globally connected world for such a time as this. I really do.
You feel they're speaking to the moment, these things, like they're...
Well, so if you even look throughout history, I'll just go back quickly. When evil seems to be on the rise, you can find in history that God elevates the testimony of his goodness and his reality. I'll give you one example that actually I go into a little bit in the new book, and Imagine the God of Heaven. That think about late 1940s, right? Here Hitler and a whole group of people are becoming deceived into thinking that we determine who lives and who dies. This is evil at its greatest, right? But it's not new. And they want to conquer the world with their view. And so it's World War II. And at the same time, secretly, they are literally exterminating the Jewish race. 6 million, Jewish people.
Many of my ancestors, yes.
Oh, is that right?
Yes, I come from the Jewish faith, yes.
Yeah. Okay, so one of the things that actually led me to faith, what was not so much near-death experiences, though that got me open, but it was actually someone pointing out to me what God had done through the Jewish prophets to show in history he was real. So in the book of Isaiah, and Isaiah is fascinating. See, I'll go too far, so stop me.
No, I love it.
Isaiah,
old and new. Yeah.
Well, Isaiah is so fascinating because so two things happened in 1948 as evil is on the rise. In 1948, first of all, we find the Dead Sea Scrolls.
That's right.
Most people don't even know what the significance is. 38 out of the 39 books of the Old Testament were found in the Dead Sea Scrolls, most of them predating Jesus. Okay, so in the copies of them. And we found a complete scroll of Isaiah dating from about 200 to 300 BCE. Now, Isaiah wrote in about 780 BCE, but we have evidence of a scroll predating Jesus, all right? But in Isaiah, one of the things God says, and he said this all the way back to Moses, he said, here's how you'll know I am the true God. I alone can tell you what is going to happen in history and how it'll actually happen. And then in Isaiah chapter 11, he says that one of the things that's going to happen in the latter days is that I'm going to regather the scattered people of Judah, the Jewish people, I'm going to take the people of Israel from the four quarters of the earth where they've been scattered to, and as a sign to the nations. He specifically says, and this is what I like to point out, is that God, the God of the Jewish people, has been the God of the whole world. He's the only one who 500 times he's speaking to all the nations. All the way back in Genesis 12, he says to Abraham and Sarah, I'm going to raise you up into a nation to bless all the nations.
To be a light unto all the nations, yes.
To be a light unto the... So it was never about the chosen people because God loves them more, they're more special. It was a responsibility because God loves all people of all nations. So here in Isaiah 11, he says, I'm going to regather the scattered people of Israel a second time. Okay. Now, the first time they were scattered was the Babylonian invasion, and they were regathered back to Israel in about 400 or 500 BCE. But in 1948, so in 70 AD, the Romans wiped out Jerusalem. The temple was destroyed. The Jewish people were scattered, and over the entire earth for 1900 years. Now think about this. How can you keep a people together for 1900 years when they have no government, no land, no common language? How do you do that? And yet, in 1948, people from, Jews from Poland and Germany, Jews from Russia, Jews from North Africa, Jews from the United States, from all over, start to flock back to Israel. Actually, a little before that, and then in 1948, something happened that in Isaiah 66, God said, "Has a nation ever been born overnight?" Of course, the answer is no. It's never happened. How would you do that? He said, "But no sooner is Zion, which is the mountain on which Jerusalem is, in labor." Okay, now think about that. In labor, the pains of labor, of giving birth. And here the Jewish people have been through the worst pain of evil ever imaginable. No sooner is Zion in labor than I bring her children to birth. Rejoice with Jerusalem. And in 1948,
the state of Israel was born.
And born overnight.
Remarkable.
But God said, this is a sign to all the nations. I am God, and I love and I care about all people of all nations. So yeah, so I'm trying to show that, this God of all nations, who is love and who is light, didn't just show up in the age of near-death experiences. He's been revealing himself all along. Now, I think at the same time, he is doing something in our age. And even as we see, I believe we do see evil on the rise. So many times people say, oh, well, we're so evolved and, we're so enlightened and all that. Well, we've had more genocides in the last 100 years than in the entire history of humanity in any 100 years previous.
I agree. It seems like in many ways we're devolving, not evolving. There's individuals who are growing, but collectively. Yeah. It almost seems like what you're saying, when that darkness increases, our light is tested and needs to rise above it, too, much like an NDE.
Exactly. And I think God is raising up. So like I said, see, my problem is that was a long answer to a simple question, which is, why do you think these NDEs are coming so frequently now? I think it's because God is raising his light to a world that evil's trying to divide. And I think he's saying, look, I'm real. The life to come is real. Seek me and let me unite you as evil is trying to destroy and divide you.
Wow. And that's why your work, and Dr. Raymond Moody's work, and Prin van Lommel, and all the others are so significant, because they ground this experience as real, and they're able to bring these light to more of the masses that need to really hear it, as near-death experiences can really change the world. I really feel, people who have these experiences, like you said, I think they're used by God just to be a recollection of what God is.
Yeah.
And I think if you ask me why people are tuning into near-death experiences, because there's something familiar that a near-death experiencer shares. You don't listen to things that are outside your scope, but there's something deep inside of you that's being called to the light, that's familiar, that
Yeah.
near-death experiencers share.
Moses, God said to Moses, you don't have to go up to heaven to seek me. You don't have to dive down in the deepest sea to find me. I'm as close as your next breath. And I think you're right. I think, God has put in Imagine Heaven, I write about it like just like a homing device that these birds that fly from the Arctic all the way to South America every year back and forth. And, just a few degrees off and they're going to miss their target, but they don't. How? And there's this intuitive sense, there's a Zen parable that says, the finger is wonderful at pointing to the moon, but woe to the person who mistakes the finger for the moon. And I think in the same way, it's like we have that intuitive sense, that yearning, that longing within for more than this life can ever be. One of my favorite authors, C.S. Lewis, says it this way. He says, on earth, we have thirst, and lo and behold, there's water to satisfy the thirst. We have hunger, and there's food to satisfy the hunger. And then he says, if we find on earth a desire that nothing on earth can fully meet, it means we weren't created for earth. That we were created for something beyond to actually meet that desire. And I think that is part of what you're talking about. It's that inner homing device that God has put in all of us, that, there is something more, something beyond.
And people finding that heaven here on earth is beautiful. You don't have to go to it. It's not the destination. It could be remembered right here in the here now. That's a beautiful thing. But we certainly have a lot in common. And certainly you look at the title of my channel, The Wisdom of Jacob's Ladder. My name is Jacob, and I had a near-death experience on a ladder in a playground. And you think of biblical.
I saw that.
You think of biblical Jacob. He was being chased by his brother Esau. He was running for his life. He had a proverbial near-death experience. And then he saw the angels going up and down the ladder. So you could think of that almost as an end to East. So, the crossover.
That's fascinating.
The crossover with our work and all these things is mind-blowing, but it just shows you that I do believe in a way God is bigger than a Bible, because God is bigger than words, but God is also, two things can be true at the same time. God can also be found within the Old and the New Testament.
Yeah.
Words are limiting, but they are what we have here in this plane. And they're, just kind of like a premise to understand, this infinite intelligence inside of all things.
Yeah. And I point that out in Imagine the God of Heaven, that, Moses even said, he said, the secret things belong to God, but the things revealed belong to us and to our children, that we may follow him in all our ways. And that's an important thing. The mysterion is the way that gets translated in the Septuagint. The mysteries, there are mysteries to God. So he's revealed things in the scriptures, but there are also mysteries that we don't, and that's where back to the imagination comes in as well, is to realize. And I like to, something you just mentioned about, it influences how we live. We don't have to wait. We don't have to wait to go to heaven. God actually wants to bring more of heaven through us to earth. And that whole part 4 of Imagine the God of Heaven, I talk about doing life with the God of joy. And this is an aspect of God that, I went to seminary, and I got out all my seminary books as I was writing this again, because I was trying to tie it all together. And it just struck me that, there are all these attributes of God that theologians talk about, and they never mention joy. And yet, if you think about it, God had the entire nation of Israel throw 7 street parties, national street parties a year. They were these huge festivals. And he says, I want you to celebrate with joy together before the Lord. Well, Jesus, his last night on earth, said, I've told you these things so that my joy may be in you and your joy may overflow. And so many near-death experiencers in his presence. You know, I told you about this one Jewish girl who, interestingly, and this is the thing that's just so fascinating to me. She's a good friend of mine today, but Heidi grew up, her father was actually an atheist and pretty abusive. And he had a mantra: there is no God, your life is worthless, Jesus Christ is the biggest hoax ever perpetrated on mankind. And yet, despite this, she always prayed to God every night. She believed and prayed to God, and she felt like God was there by her bedside, comforting her. A lot of the, things she had to complain about that were legit. And at 16, her horse falls back on her and crushes her. She's up 30 feet above her body, there in the air. She knows she's dead, and a light comes over her shoulder, and she turns and looks, and she said, there was Jesus floating there 30 feet in the air. And she said, again, this light brighter than the sun, but she said, I knew exactly who he was. And she said, I wasn't surprised. Like, why is a good Jewish girl like me doing with Jesus? I'm not supposed to be with Jesus. She said, no, I knew him. He was one with the God I had always been praying to. And in her life review, he even shows that. Now, here's the other thing. Then he takes her to God the Father as well, which is a wild thing because she had no concept of this. But he turns to her with this big grin on his face, grabs her hand. Now, she's a 16-year-old who loves speed. She loves flying bareback, right? And they take off flying through our atmosphere, through our universe. And she said, but it wasn't just flying. It was more like we were surfing, but on a wave of light. And she said, Jesus is grinning ear to ear. I'm grinning. We're laughing the whole time. And it was the most fun I've ever had in my life. And, people don't think that God could be a fun or enjoyable person. And yet that again is our limited imagination. I mean, we just think if God is a creator, who created us with the ability to enjoy all the pleasures, all the things that we enjoy on this earth?
Right. It's fascinating how belief informs our behavior. In this box that we have of God will influence our conduct and our worldviews. And when that box is continually evolved, we have a different set of behaviors. And I was on a podcast a couple weeks ago, and someone asked me to define God. I said, each and every day, that's a new definition. That's a new way to understand it. It's not a set in stone definition. The origins of the definition is always there. But as people evolve and grow and expand their awareness, so too their understanding of the Lord comes with it as well. Because we have that divine spark. And as that divine spark is known and connected and expanded, we're able to understand it. But fascinating. But John, I know you have a new book that just came out in November. It's called, I believe, Imagining God in Heaven. Is that correct? And
Imagine the God of Heaven.
Imagine the God of Heaven. And that's on Amazon. And I know you mentioned a lot of this is really not intentional, but it places a lot of those questions that you faced throughout the years that try to debunk entities and really puts those questions in a court, right? So this book now is available on all platforms and everything. And who's an ideal reader, would you say, for some of your work? Like people who are interested in near-death experiences, or like what's an ideal person to come to you in your work?
Well, I think Imagine Heaven will show you through the eyes of, I think there are about 120 people that I've interviewed through those. And I'm trying to show the overlap of this journey into the life to come and just how amazing it's going to be. In the new book, Imagine the God of Heaven, I'm trying to show that through these people who have experienced God all over the globe, that God is far better than you've ever imagined. and there's no one who is more for you and with you and get you than God does. And so I think whether you're still a skeptic about God, or maybe you've been hurt or burned by, religion and what they've said, or you're all in a believer, but again, to expand that box, and where I think it'll lead you is to a greater love and a greater understanding of the joy that God wants you to have as you can walk with him right now through life.
I love it. And you're someone who's walked the talk. You live that life where right now you turned into maybe a skeptic of all these things, and now you have a firm knowing, and people could follow a similar trajectory just by being curious and open to the literature and follow the data, and to be courageous to ask questions. Because the most intelligent people will understand. I may never understand it all, but if I understand a little bit more than yesterday, I am growing, I am evolving. And that's my hope, is people could come to it. You don't have to understand it all in one sitting, but to wake up a little bit more clear than yesterday, that's a beautiful life to live.
Absolutely. And faith and doubt, they're not the opposites.
Right.
Doubt and trust, the inability to trust, that can be, but really, faith grows when we are curious and we ask questions and we learn. And sometimes we have to hold in tension what we've previously gotten comfort from. And that's not easy. That's why many people don't seek. It's kind of like, hey, I just want to be comfortable.
Yeah.
And so sometimes it makes us uncomfortable. And yet where it brings us, ultimately, for what it brings us to is a greater understanding of what near-death experiencers commonly say is God is love, and how we treat and love one another is what matters most. And so,
absolutely. It's something I always preach in my work, where you look at the planet, it was once seen as flat, and all of a sudden people were daring enough to question that notion. They explored, the viewpoints, and they found that was not the case. And when people study near-death experiencers, it could challenge the way that you view life, and to see that it's a whole different set of, it's a whole different world and universe than maybe the one that you were viewing, and it changed the world. My last question, John, before we go is, we're recording this video right around the holidays. I know a lot of people are going through grief. I know certainly in your pastoral work, you counsel a lot of people, and it seems like a lot of the near-death experience works very closely with grief. But is there one message as we come to this holiday season that maybe you could say to people who might be struggling with the loss of a loved one, or that empty chair at that table? Because I certainly know belief does tend to work well with grief. It doesn't certainly immunize it, but it could really allow you to walk parallel with it. So I'm wondering, with your research that you found, is there a message that you may have, or maybe there's nothing to say, and maybe just kind of leave, what we had in this conversation as such?
No, I absolutely think two things, because I've had many people reach out to me and say, just like this conversation I literally just had, he had read Imagine Heaven because he was literally so despondent. He was thinking about taking his life because he and his twin were so connected, and a lot of guilt there too, because he couldn't resuscitate him and he died. And I know the difficult part is that grief is loss. And so even knowing the hope of what's to come doesn't take us out of having to walk through that loss. And there are stages that you have to go through. And that's part of the healing. But here's what you need to know. One, it's not forever. This life is a continuum into the life to come. And I think that's part of why God wants us to know him, because he wants us to know the hope of not only God with us in this life, but us with each other and God in the life to come. And then also realizing that God gets your grief and he's not sitting on his hands, that God grieves with you. And in Imagine the God of Heaven, I've got stories from people who have had near-death experiences, and you see that's true. God is a God of joy, but he's also a God who understands the full range of human emotion. And it's not like it doesn't affect him. He's a very emotional God.
Right.
And
Our
where?
intelligence or emotional range does not surpass God's. God,
No,
who do you think
no.
created and orchestrated all those things?
Exactly.
Right.
And I say that because you can turn to him in your grief.
Mm.
And there's nothing, he just wants honesty. You can be mad, you can yell at him. But he wants you to turn to him because he wants to walk through that. And I'll tell you back to where we started with my story. I remember, when I lost my dad, um, I was, because I'd read that book, I was starting to consider, well, maybe God's real. Maybe there is a God. And I'll tell you, just kind of as a, a little bit of a test, I started praying, okay, God, if you're real, heal my dad. Well, he didn't.
Mm.
And so I was at this fork in the road that I think many people have been at. And I was kind of like, well, screw you then. If you are real, I don't want anything to do with you.
Mm.
And maybe that just proves to me you're not real.
Right.
And I'm having this moment, literally in my mind, having this moment. And I'm in grief. I'm in pain because my dad was like my best friend. And I hear a thought in my head. I will be your father now.
Mm.
And I thought, well, maybe, I just thought that. But I kind of said, well, here's the thought I had was, okay, I've already lived life where there is no God. And if that's true, then my dad's death is just loss.
Mm.
That's it. There is no hope. We're just fooling ourselves, and yet why would I have grief? And why would, because this is the most natural thing ever. People die.
Mm.
And so I said, okay, God, then if there is hope, then I do want you to be like a father to me. And I'll tell you, Jacob, the wildest thing is years later in the Psalms, I read, a father to the fatherless is God in his dwelling.
Mm.
I mean, this is like decades later. And I was like, oh my gosh, that was the thought that came into my head. And so, he will meet you. He will meet you in your grief. And you can just turn to him in honesty.
Thank you for sharing that. That was quite moving. And I, as a near-death experiencer, I totally agree. I had my near-death experience in a playground. And I was just a child at the young age of 3 years old. And to me, it's allegorical how we are all God's children playing in the eternal playground of God. And you mentioned play and joy. And that's what this is about. And certainly at times we could feel like we're lost from the playground, but we're forever connected to it as God's children. And God will always take us back to this place. It's always in the depths of our hearts. And so John Burke, Pastor John Burke, I thank you and applaud the work that you're doing and all the minds and hearts that you continually to touch. I know God picked the right one with your work. I could say that. I know, for you, you're a very humble man, but I thank you for your continual service and the steep calling that really started, like from you said, from grief. And, to me, it seemed like there was an after effect of grief where it posed you to ask bigger questions about bigger life circumstances and it posed you on a much different trajectory. And I encourage all of my viewers to follow, in that similar set. Your future self won't regret it. So thank you, John Burke, for your generosity, your time, and all your contributions to humanity.
Well, same to you, Jacob. And thanks for having me on.
An honor. You're welcome back anytime, my brother. Thank you. That was a wonderful conversation with John Burke, near-death experience researcher. I love that he was able to really tie in, a lot of the biblical scriptures with near-death experiences, something that I don't hear every day, and really discuss a lot of his findings as a researcher in the field of near-death experiences and what he's been able to found and how it has changed his life. And I'm sure millions and thousands of others who have heard and listened to John has read his books. I do recommend checking out John Burke as well as his latest book release, Imagining the God of Heaven. And for those of you tuning into my channel, we thank you for tuning into this interview. Please make sure you share our interview as well as your comments. Hit that like button, subscribe, so you can continually to assist to grow the Wisdom Jacob's Ladder channel to reach more minds, hearts, and souls who could benefit from our conversations here on a weekly basis. Thank you all for ascending the ladder. Let's continue to evolve and grow together as one. Thank you.